this is Julie and welcome back to Weekends with YSJ, a video series where we'll build a game in YSJ.net. Today we'll focus on coding player movement. Let's go ahead and start out by opening GameGrid.cs. A quick review of what we've got already here. We've got several methods, so write-to-grid, which given coordinates will write an object to the grid. Check valid coordinates, so given coordinates it will check that those coordinates are within the grid space. And read from grid, which given coordinates will read something from that grid space. So for player movement, we want to do something similar to write to grid, except the problem with this is it just, so long as the coordinates are valid, it writes it to the grid. It doesn't check to see if there's already an object in that grid space. So whatever grid space the player wants to move to, we want to first check to see if there's already an object there. And then if there's already an object there, then the player won't move, right? The attempt to move will fail. So let's add a new function. And this is called MovementAttemptWriteToGrid, right? So we take a string, so the object that's going to be moved, in this case we're going to move our player, the previous x and y position, so before the player moves their x and y position, right? The original x and y position of the player, and then the new x and y position, so the coordinates that we're attempting to move to. So first we'll check and make sure that the new place we're trying to move to is valid, right? So we'll call the check valid coordinates method. I wrote a to-do here, so we need to check for collisions when we attempt to write over an object. But for now, we're just going to check to make sure the space is empty, right? So we're not going to have any special code for player colliding with different objects. We'll get into that later. For now, it's just if the space is empty, we can move into it. If it's not empty, we can't go there. Okay, so we take our grid. So if you remember here, our grid is our array of strings, right, that contains all the objects in the game. So if grid x new y new is null, then we're going to set it to s, right? So that's the player moving to the new space, right? The player is now at the new coordinates. And then we need to delete the player from the previous location, right? Because otherwise they would still be there. They would be just existing in two grid squares. So we'll look at the coordinates x previous, y previous, and then we'll just set that to null, so the player is no longer there. So let's go ahead and save this, and then let's go ahead and test this out. So if I go to page 1, sorry, not the designer, we want the code. Right click, view code. Here we go. And currently when I click on the button, it writes to grid hello, so we can get rid of that. We don't want that. Okay, so instead, so we're going to use our grid. So if you remember, that is our game grid object where we have all of our game objects stored. So grid, and then we're going to call our new method. So MovementAttemptWriteToGrid. The IntelliSense is popping up here to show me what to do. So first we've got our string, so that's going to be our player, right? We're attempting to move our player. We need the previous x and y coordinates. So here we did write-to-grid. We'll put player at 1, 1. We'll just put them in the corner. So our previous coordinates will be 1, 1, and then our new coordinates, so let's see, so it's x and then y, let's keep x the same, and then y will change by 1, so it'll be 0. So whenever I press the up button, it'll move the player to that specific square. So let's test this. There's our player at coordinates 1, 1. We press the up button, they move to 1, 0. And then if I press the up button again, nothing happens, right? Because all we did was hard code the player movement. So let's go ahead and add some more buttons so we can move in directions other than up. And then let's go ahead and actually code this so it moves based on the current position of the player, and it doesn't hard code move the player to a very specific grid square. Okay, so let's go ahead and go into the designer and then add some buttons so we can move in all directions. So here's the designer. So this is our button we had before to move in the up direction. Let's go ahead and just resize that real quick. So if I go to properties and then size, I can just manually enter a size here. So let's go 50 by 50. There we go, so it's a nice square. And then I just need to add more buttons, so let's just grab those from the toolbox. Go ahead and delete the text. And we'll make it 50 by 50. And let's set the icon. Let's see, how did I do the last one? I did an image source. So we'll go to image source, theme images, and then let's see, this will be our right button, so we'll do an arrow to the right. There we go. Actually, do I have a different one? There we go. Okay, and then I'll speed this up. I'll go ahead and do the rest of the buttons real quick. I'm just going to move these here. This top button looks different. Let's see if I can change that. There we go. Okay, so let's save that and let's run that real quick. There we go, and then our top button works, and then the rest of these buttons don't do anything yet, right? And then each of these buttons needs a click event. I can just go to lightning bolt and double click. So there we go, that button has a click event. And I can go ahead and add it for the other ones. Actually, I just realized something. When I added the click event, it's called button 3, so let me control Z to undo it. Because I actually want to rename these, right? So this is button up. This will be button right. So if I go to properties, name, button right. This will be button left. And this will be button down. And then I can just click on each button. So I just double click there. There's the click event. It's called button right. Double click, button left. And double click, button down. So now we just need to add code to each of these click events. Okay, so let's get some basic player movement working. So we've got our click events here. We have one more, the up button click. I'm just going to move that down here. Not that it really matters, just so we can see everything easier. So we need to change this so that it's unique for every direction, and also so that it's based on the player's current position, right? Instead of being hard-coded to the player starting at the position of 1-1. So let's go ahead and save the player position in some variables. So int player x equals 1, int player y equals 1. So this will be the position of the player, and then when the player is initially created, instead of being created at 1-1, that will be created at player x, player y. Okay, and then when we go to move them, the previous position will be player x, player y. Okay, so we just need to change these. So if you go up, x will stay the same, and y, we will subtract 1. The way this coordinate system works is that the 0, 0 coordinate for y is at the top of the screen, right? So as the player moves up, the y actually decreases, which is a little bit counterintuitive to what you would think. So let's go ahead and try this. Let's see, and then we also need to update the player y position. Right, so after that we've moved our player, we update the player y position so that if we attempt to move them again, the player y is still correct. And then we'll do similar code for the rest of the directions. So if they go to the right, so we're changing our x position, increasing by 1. Then if they go to the left, so our x decreases by 1. And then if they go down, then our y increases by 1. Okay, so let's test this out. So we can move to the right, we can move to the left, we can move down, we can move up. And then let's see what happens when we hit a wall. Okay, so I'm next to the wall, and then one more click I will be on top of the wall, and then another click I move over. So you can see we have this kind of glitch here where we can kind of move through walls. So if you look, so this is fine. This is fine, I'm next to the wall. One more click, I'm on top of the wall, although it doesn't look like it. And then another click, I move off of the wall. And you'll notice I left that previous player behind. So we need to go ahead and fix this glitch here. We need to keep the player from moving through walls. So let's go to our GameGrid class, and let's look at MovementAttemptWriteToGrid. So what we're going to do here is we're going to change the return type here. So it returns an array of integers, and this is just going to be an array that has the x and y coordinates. And so we've got a new documentation comment here. So it'll return the new location of the object if it successfully moved, and the old location if it did not move, right? And then based on what it returns, we're going to either move the player to the new location or keep them in the same position. Let's see, I'll delete this because we're actually going to add some collision code here. So, right, if we're trying to move into an empty space, so that's good. And then we're going to create a point equals x new, y new. Oh, sorry, this should be in brackets. And we're going to return that point. The string, which remember represents our player in this case, the new coordinate will be how we'll have the player string, the previous coordinate will be null, and then we're going to go ahead and return the new position of the player, which is x new, y new. Okay, so that's great. That's what we try and move into an empty space. But let's see what happens if we try and move into a wall. Right, so this is our collision code. And let's go ahead and say if the player tries to run into a wall. So if the grid x previous y previous, right? So this is our initial position, right? At the initial position, and then we're getting the object in the grid at that initial position, right? So if that initial thing is a player, and the new thing, so the thing at the grid in the new position, so grid x new, y new, oh, it auto-corrected to null. So if the thing in the new position is a wall, okay, so in this case we've collided with a wall, so we want to prevent the player from moving. So our point is not going to be x new, y new. It's going to be x previous, y previous. And then we'll go ahead and return the point. And just so that this will compile and we have a return value for all possible cases, we'll do an else statement. And so this is if something is moving into the same space as something else, but not a player or a wall, right? So just some other type of collision. We'll just do the same code and we'll just prevent the collision. The other thing that we need to add is we did if check valid coordinates, we need an else statement to that if. So if the coordinates are not valid, so we're just going to add an else down here. And then we're just going to, again, just stop it from moving. So we just pass back the previous coordinates. Okay, so save that. Let's go to page 1. Okay, so now that our function MovementAttemptWriteToGrid is returning coordinates, let's go ahead and update this code to actually use those coordinates. So let's go ahead and save them. Right, so here we have an array of integers called new position, right? So MovementAttemptWriteToGrid will return something. Either it will return the previous position if the player ran into a wall and the player isn't going to be moving, or it will return the new position if the player is moving into a new square and it was successfully able to move. So either way, that'll get stored in new position. And in this case, when we're moving up, we want to change the y. I could, I suppose, technically change the x as well, but it's kind of redundant because we're not changing the x value. When you move up, you're only changing the y value, right? So in player y, instead of subtracting 1, it's going to equal new position 1, right? Because the coordinates go x comma y, so x is at the 0 position, y is at the 1 position, right? Because remember, we always start counting from 0. And then I just need to do this same thing for all of the other ones. So if we're going right, player x is going to be new position 0. And then if we're going down, we've got the y position, so it'll be new position 1. Oh, and then just another note here. You notice they all say GameCanvas.invalidate at the end. So that's just to force a redraw of the canvas, right? So this will cause the player to move, and this will cause the game canvas to be redrawn so we actually see the player in their new position. So that's why we always have GameCanvas.invalidate in every single one of these click events. All right, so movement is working. And then moment of truth, let's try and move through a wall. Okay, so I've clicked, I'm right next to the wall. I click again, I would be on top of the wall. I click again, I would be over the wall. Right, so you notice no matter how many times I click, I cannot move through this wall. If I back up and try it again, I still can't. I try and go from the top, nope. Can't move through. Can't move through. All right, so that is basic player movement done, as well as collision with walls. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Weekends with YSJ. Go ahead and stay tuned for more updates. Bye!